Now, let's have a look at our top story for you this morning. And number 10 has admitted to releasing 37 prisoners by mistake, several of which have still not gone back to jail. The error happening, in part at least, thanks to the government's controversial early release scheme.
Well, the Ministry of Justice claimed to be working in tandem with the police to urgently find those 5 inmates who are yet to be returned.
Well, that's as Labour is reportedly drawing up plans to introduce a Texas-style prison system with a points-based approach for good conduct.
The government will also look to invest in rehabilitation projects in a bid to curb overcrowding in prisons.
So, is Labour really in control of law and order? Let's talk to our political correspondent, Olivia Utley. Morning, Olivia. I mean, this actually is a pretty big scandal because although it was the worst, best option to release people early, that's what the Labour Party was saying at the time, the fact that people have been released by mistake is pretty grim.
Well, absolutely. And people were sort of predicting that something like this might happen because of the rush with which Labour carried out this plan. As you say, there was a necessity to do something. There was a point when there were only sort of 150 places left in male prisons across the whole country. But lots and lots of parole officers were warning back in August that the way that the government was fast-tracking the plan meant that there was a lot of room for people to sort of slip through the gaps. And that seems to be exactly what's happened. Whether this is all just a sort of, necessity thing is another question which I think is really interesting. Keir Starmer is sort of claiming that because the Conservatives left the prison sector in such a terrible state, he had no choice but to release some prisoners early. There is definitely a lot of truth in that. But it also must be said that his prisons minister, James Timpson, who set up Timpson's, the shoe repair and key-cutting shop that employs former prisoners, he fundamentally ideologically believes, and has said so multiple times on the record, that he believes that too many people are in prison. So there is also an ideological drive from Labour to get people out of prisons earlier. And I think that's playing into what they did back in early September with this early release scheme.
And they're now looking to Texas in terms of prison reform. It's a points-based system based on good behaviour. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, so looking to Texas sounds a little bit alarming.
It does.
Obviously, Texas has quite a lot of people on death row. But it also has quite a liberal scheme, actually, to deal with its less serious offenders. So those who aren't violent offenders, haven't committed, crimes like murder, those people would be on death row. But those who've committed smaller offences are able to earn credit through going to drug rehabilitation programmes or going to agricultural school or doing various lessons in prison. They're able to earn credit, and that can buy them some time off their sentence. And ultimately, they only have to serve 25% of their time in prison. Now, Labour's early release scheme brought it down from 50% to 40%. This scheme will bring it down to 25%, and 25% could include some credits earned. So some people could end up spending actually very little time in prison at all.
That sounds very controversial, but I mean, is there evidence that it works from Texas in the sense that you are encouraging people to reform?
Well, it works in the sense that Texas had an enormous problem with massive prison overcrowding, and that problem has lessened now. Whether it's helping people to reform, it's not really quite clear. It hasn't been going for long enough. You don't have the full picture of how it's worked in the round. But it has worked to tackle the immediate problem of overcrowding, and that for the government now is something that must be addressed really, really urgently.
Can we talk about Lord Alli's flat, who is the Labour donor? Because this isn't going away for the Labour Party, is it? And this is the latest revelation. It's the use of this £18 million penthouse by Sir Keir Starmer, not only during COVID lockdowns, but also in response to the late Queen Elizabeth's death, where he gave a message to the public. So let's just have a little clip.
The new variant, Omicron, is spreading fast, and the argument that we don't know enough about it doesn't stack up. We may not be certain how dangerous it is, but we do know that lives are at risk. At times like this, we must all put the national interest first and play by the rules. Getting jabbed, wearing masks, and working from home if we can really will help prevent infections.
And some accusing Sir Keir Starmer of hoodwinking the public after, as you can see in that clip, using Lord Alli's apartment but putting his own family photos and Christmas cards in the background to make it look as though he was at home.
Well, it is all a little bit weird. We now know that Keir Starmer was using this £20 million penthouse in Covent Garden. He claims that he's been using it recently because his son needed some space to revise in peace over the election season for his GCSEs, although it doesn't seem actually the time doesn't seem to match up exactly. GCSE season and the time when the flat was being used aren't exactly the same. But now it has emerged that Keir Starmer was also recorded that message during the COVID lockdowns from Lord Alli's apartment. And as you say, he's made it look like his own house with pictures of his family behind him. Now, that could get him in trouble in terms of the lockdown rules, because working from home was allowed, but working from someone else's home is another question.
Oh, don't tell me we're gonna end up with basically another Partygate in effect, or another flat-sitting gate, or whatever. Surely not. God, you never know, do you?
Well, there's questions. Yeah, and I mean, those excuses, the GCSE excuse, for example, I mean, that will fly with lots of people, but for others, it just doesn't add up.
No, and I think as we find out more about the exact timescale that the Starmers were using this flat will be quite interesting, because it does look as though actually GCSEs had hardly started before they stopped using the flat. And if that was the purpose, then why was his son not there for the duration of the GCSE period?
Lots of people have children doing GCSEs. They don't move into another house so that children have room to revise.
Well, he would say lots of children wouldn't have paparazzi and journalists outside the front door. That's his reasoning.
Yes, well, do you buy that? gbnews.com/your say. Let us know. Olivia, thank you very much indeed. See you a little bit later on. Now, world leaders have gathered at the United Nations in New York over fears of escalating tensions in the Middle East as Israel's army chief announced it's preparing for a ground offensive in Lebanon in an attempt to eliminate Hezbollah.
US President Joe Biden has voiced fears of an all-out war and called for a 21-day ceasefire as Sir Keir Starmer demanded a diplomatic solution to the conflict.
In relation to Lebanon, I'm very worried about the escalation and calling for all parties to step back from the brink to de-escalate. We need a ceasefire so this can be sorted out diplomatically.
Well, Lebanon's health ministry has reported 620 people have been killed by Israeli airstrikes so far, with a further 500,000 potentially displaced by the bombing campaign.
Well, our political editor, Christopher Hope, is in New York following the events at the United Nations Summit and brings us this report.
It's a huge day here in New York City for Sir Keir Starmer. Today he addresses the UN General Assembly. That's a big deal for any Prime Minister, but for him, really symbolic and important. The first Labour Prime Minister to address the UN for 15 years, and a chance for him to introduce himself to world leaders in the formal setting of the United Nations. Before that, he's got a business roundtable with senior players here in New York, maybe to encourage some of them to invest in UK PLC. Britain is open for business, he will tell the leaders of companies like Blackstone, Citigroup and Macquarie at a business roundtable. That comes after a busy time diplomatically. Yesterday, he was talking to President Zelensky from Ukraine, encouraging him in his battles with Russia to fight back against the invading troops, and also see whether the US and UK can support his plans to try and win that war and fight back against Russia once and for all. The clock is ticking on that because, as we know, we've got a change of government here in America. We might see Donald Trump replace Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. Either of those choices could lead to changes in the US support for Ukraine, and that's why it's so important, I think, to get some agreement and some movement on that issue there as Ukraine fights against Russia. But none of that can obscure the problems that await him at home. He's got his battles with his own party about the controversial plan to withdraw the winter fuel payment from pensioners. 10 million of them upset. We've heard on GB News repeatedly about many are fearing for this winter. He had his own party voting against him in his party conference yesterday. And that is important. The first vote ever on this policy. Don't forget, this policy was not included in Labour's manifesto. And that's why it's so symbolic and so awkward for Sir Keir Starmer. Added to that, he's got a battle over freebies, his acceptance of thousands of pounds of new clothes, using a flat and the like. Again, it's dogging him. He can't quite escape that. Will he try and do something firm and deal with that? And also concerned about Sue Gray, his chief of staff. Not even 3 months into his time as Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer's finding out just how challenging it can be domestically when things come at you from left field you haven't been expecting, and here on the global stage trying to construct various alliances to deal with issues facing the UK.
Right, time to take through the papers this morning with the legendary Pat Sharp.
Oh, thank you.
And the very nearly legendary Emma Wolf. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Emma,
Good morning.
let's start with... I know we touched on this in the last hour, but it's such a great story. Keir Starmer in the £18 million penthouse which he uses from time to time.
He does. This is juicy, this story. I'm trying to think of a polite way of putting it. Basically, this is the kind of furore that's been really overshadowing the Labour Party conference, which should have been, their victory march. It should have been their celebration after so long out of power, and instead of which every single journalist wanted to know what is going on with Lord Alli, with the donations, with the frocks and the glasses, and now this penthouse, this £18 million penthouse. I believe it's in Covent Garden. Starmer told us, the Prime Minister told us, that his son needed it for his GCSE. So once again, using their children as an excuse, free tickets. Well, my child needed to go to see Taylor Swift, this kind of thing. So his child apparently needed a quiet space to revise for his GCSEs. Unfortunately for Starmer, the dates don't really tally. So the dates when he had the use of the penthouse don't really add up with the GCSE season. And then this footage has appeared of him during 2021. He was filming COVID videos from this place, from this crash pad in the centre of town, with Christmas cards and family photos in the background, which is all very odd. So was Starmer trying to make out that it was his family home? What was going on there? How much time was spent there? And the Daily Mail are asking some very juicy questions. Why did he and his family stay in this place for a month after the GCSE exam season finished? Why did Sir Keir Starmer shoot these videos at Lord Alli's flat and not in his own home? Blah, blah, blah. They've got about 10 questions, and I think the Prime Minister needs to answer.
And there are questions, aren't there? Because the family home is a large property, large family home in Kentish Town, only a few miles away. So what's the need for this very large penthouse in Covent Garden?
Well, the only worry I have is when Emma mentioned Christmas time with the picture, was it all gift wrapped?
Oh, ha, ha, ha. Very good. Look, I tell you what, I can imagine you with an £18 million penthouse.
Clearly. Yeah, well, I'm probably not, being not the Prime Minister, if anybody wants to gift me an £18 million penthouse, I will obviously live in it. But I'd rather work harder for it, to be honest with you, myself. And I don't have one, so you're imagining wrong.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I'm trying to keep track of who I've lent, which a penthouse I've lent.
Yeah.
But, there is a serious side to this. People talking about the blatant hypocrisy here. When the Labour Party are talking about things like taking away the VAT exemption on private schools, which are often used for disabled and children with special needs, and the hypocrisy, feeling that his son's education was that important, if this is true, that it was so important that he needed a quiet place to revise when other children are going to be suffering. So people are very angry about this.
It's my GCSE revision down the pub with a pint of mild and a Hamlet.
Oh, I'm impressed with GCSEs. I was an O-level man, showing our age.
I'm much, much younger.
And I did it in the local library to escape my 5 brothers and sisters. So, kids do have to... Well, kids do have to
Well, they have to
revise where
manage,
they
don't
can.
they?
Exactly.